Okay, so I would like to welcome and introduce my guest for today's interview. And my guest is the esteemed barrister, Maryam Syed. So Maryam, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
It's lovely to be here with you, Sonia. Thank you.
So Maryam, I have done quite a bit of research on you, and you have a list of accolades and accomplishments that go on and on and on for days. I just don't have the time to list all of them, but I am just going to do a brief summary. So you are a barrister, you were called to the bar in 1993. You're practicing from 7 Bedford Row in London. You are also a Crown Court judge, and you've been a Crown Court judge since 2012. And you have recently been made a Silk, a King's Counsel. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. So kind.
You're also a commentator, a writer, a public speaker. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So congratulations on all of your accomplishments and achievements. Tell us about your family background and where you were born. So where you were born, where you grew up.
Sure. So my parents came here from Pakistan in the 60s. They were both born before Pakistan existed, so it was just all India back then before partition. So my father was born in Jalandhar, which is now in India, and my mother was born in Lahore, which is now Pakistan. So I am Punjabi through and through. And I suppose that's why I say I'm sort of Indian Pakistani, but my family then moved to Pakistan. And that's where my parents grew up. But they then came in the 60s and they moved around, but eventually settled in Wimbledon Park, which is sort of near the tennis courts. And they were the first Muslim family who had ever arrived in Wimbledon Park. And we then had a mosque that then was built at the end of our road, which is still there. And growing up sort of in the late 70s, early 80s was difficult. The National Front was still very much in operation, so a white extremist organization. So some of my earliest memories were sort of washing painted swastikas off our front door and our front garden walls, which I used to do with my mother. My father was a university lecturer, a teacher, and my mother was a homemaker. Although she was educated to university standard, she had degrees in Pakistan in home sciences, but she came and she decided to be a homemaker when she came here, although she worked later. In terms of my sister's an academic, my brother has just qualified as a police officer. As far as my journey and sort of my family makeup, there were no immediate lawyers in my family. I went to state school in Wimbledon Park. I became one of the head girls of the girls' high school, which was actually situated in Princess Diana's old land almost. So it was called Rickard's Lodge because Princess Diana's family had a hunting lodge there, and that was actually part of the school. And I knew at a very sort of early stage that I wanted to be a lawyer. There's a cliche that Asian girls grow up to be either lawyers or doctors, or Asian children grow up to be lawyers or doctors. And although I did think about sciences, it did sort of, I've said this in other talks, it sort of went on my school reports when I was 8, that this girl is going to grow up to be a barrister. So there was obviously a lack of imagination on my part. But, and then just, if just continuing the story, really, I had always had an idea. I sort of grew up just seeing, and I mean, I really do mean this, people do say this, but I really do mean it. I just was very conscious of injustice, and I could see it everywhere growing up. And I was moved forward in school when I was 7. And so I should have done GCSEs, but I ended up doing O-levels. And I worked out a trajectory from there that I could possibly become the youngest woman to ever become a barrister at that time. I'm sure that there are many who've overtaken me since. And I was told that was right. But I obviously, my parents were, we were not a hugely wealthy family. I had got a Saturday job when I was 14, working for the London Borough of Merton as a librarian. And I, in fact, kept that job until I was in my 3rd year of practice as a barrister, because I was not making any money. And that's a different story, and I could explain why. And I always knew that that's what I wanted to do. And so I went to South Bank University because I was aware that they had an exchange program with City University in New York, which was funded by the Law Society and the Bar Council. And it was to allow people to go practice or to go visit in America for up to 2 months. And I had already decided that I wanted to apply for that. And I had already in mind that my focus was going to be a Black or Asian judge, because they didn't have any that I could see here. And I wanted that experience. So obviously Muslim girls aren't supposed to ever leave the home generally at that time. And I had to sort of say to my father, I really want to do this. And I was very young, I was 16, 17, and I was absolutely terrified, and I'd never been away from my family at all.
Can I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
Did you have to work hard to persuade your dad to let you go?
Yeah, but he's an academic, and so I basically said to him, look, it's, I'm going to have to work really hard. I'm going to be interviewed. I'm going to have to show my academic sort of prowess, such as it is. And he sort of drove me to the Savoy Hotel where the interviews were taking place, and he sort of sat outside in the car with my mum. And I went in, and I was very blessed. They awarded me the first place. And so I was then able to say what I wanted. And I said, I don't know if you do this because you've given lots of options, but I would like to, we call it marshalling here. They call it intern in America. I would like to intern for a Black or Asian woman judge. And they went to see if they could organize that. And then they came back and said, yeah, we found a lady and she's very interested in a judge and she would very much like to have you. So I was very honored that for about 8 weeks, I interned for the Honorable Michelle Weston Patterson. She's now Justice Weston. She's been obviously elevated. She sat in the Supreme Court of New York, and I would sit on the bench with her. And then I would be her legal assistant behind the scenes. And I got to meet all her surrounding team. But then also the scholarship was really good because we met lots of different organizations, the American Bar Association, the American Legal Aid Organization, sort of death row organizations, the District Attorneys Group. And it was sort of a very wide experience, but it's one that just confirmed that I wanted to do this because it allowed me to see the things that they do in America and compare it back here. And they had, obviously, I was sitting through things that I would never have sat through in England. So I was sitting through multiple serial killer trials. I was sitting through trials where there was drugs on a scale that we just have no experience of in England at that time. But for me, the main thing was that there was far more diversity amongst the senior leadership in terms of lawyers, in terms of judiciary. I'm not saying that there wasn't blatant discrimination, because there was, because my judge would tell me stories about, in America, all judges have judicial number plates, which we don't here. And she would tell me that if she ever went for a law conference in the south of America, she would always get pulled over by the police because they, one, couldn't understand why she was driving an expensive car, and two, why she had a judicial number plate. But I also got to meet inspirational judges. So one of the requests we made was to meet the legendary Black judge, Bruce Wright, who was known as Cut 'em Loose Bruce. He'd written a book about the justice system and the discriminatory effect on Black and Asian people in the justice system. So I sort of came back from that experience knowing what I wanted to do. And so I went to university when I was 16.
Wow.
So I turned 17 when that was in my second year. And so then I qualified with an LLB honours from South Bank, and knew that I wanted to go straight to the bar, because I still had in my head that I didn't want to waste the advantage, the blessing of having skipped a year. I wanted to get straight into it.
You decided that you wanted to go straight to the bar. Now, we were called in both 1993, and when I applied for pupillage, I had to write letters direct to chambers. And I remember having to write 100 letters in order to secure pupillage. What was your experience?
Oh, very similar. And I went, and you had to really, I mean, the first thing for me was how to pay for the actual bar finals. And I knew that I had to carefully pick an Inns of Court. And I looked at the diversity sector very carefully. And for me, the most diverse at the time was Lincoln's Inn, because it had links to India, Pakistan, Malaysia. It had a long history and tradition. So I applied, and then I was accepted. But then I said that I needed funding. So although I was still working as a librarian, it was going to cost several £1,000s. So I applied for a Thomas More bursary, and I then was awarded the Thomas More bursary, which then paid for my bar finals. And at that point, to your point, obviously you apply for pupillage even before you get at bar school, because you have to start, making those inquiries. And I applied to all the places that I aspired to be, the Tuxes, the Garden Courts, the Doughty Streets, but everywhere that was in crime. And you do apply everywhere. And I also was very clear, even then, that I was very conscious that people who looked like me tended to go to the human rights chambers, only defended, and I wanted to be different. And I thought I wanted to make a difference by doing everything. So I wanted to be a prosecutor, because I didn't see anybody who looked like me who was a prosecutor. And I think you can affect justice by being in the room, not just defending, but by prosecuting, by speaking to the prosecuting authorities, by speaking to the police, by being a voice that they don't expect to hear. And so I'd made that conscious decision, which even though I was applying to places like Turks, they don't prosecute. So
I went to talks and yeah, the first day at talks, the clerk sat me down and said, now, what cases do you not want to do? And I said, oh, well, I don't want to do any rape cases where consent is the issue. And obviously I don't want to prosecute. But if you prosecute, you are a better barrister. You are more well-rounded, in my opinion.
That was always my view. And I think I'm a better prosecutor because I defend. I'm a better defense counsel because I prosecute. And I'm a better judge because I do both. I have a mantra, which I often say, I write about it, I teach about it, which is that you cannot aspire to be what you simply cannot see. And so I could not see anyone who looked like me. And so, God, this all sounds very pompous, but it was in my head, and it was always what was in my heart. And so I applied, and I had some awful pupillage interviews. I won't name them, but I went to one very famous criminal set, where I was faced with a table of white older men who just said to me, the first question they asked me is, what is your experience of discrimination in this profession? And I just looked at them and I just said, the makeup of this table.
Oh, God. Well, I bet that went down well.
Yeah.
I bet you were offered pupillage.
No, but I deliberately said it, and I could see some of my, I had stories from some of my colleagues, who were from the right background, who were not my color. And, it was all sort of, they were related to somebody, or they went to school with somebody. And so that was already, what we now call Nepo babies.
Yeah.
That was very much in existence, but you just had to keep going, applying and applying. And so I got my pupillage. I did my first 6 with Carl Tepper and the late lamented Jocelyn Gibbs.
Gray's Inn.
One Gray's Inn Square. And then I went to what is now 187 Fleet Street, but was then 1 Middle Temple Lane. There weren't many who looked like me. And within the pupillage experience, you know, there was a lot of discrimination, and I, you know, suffered financially from it, because traditionally the Black and Asian pupils would be given the worst work to do. And particularly there was a particular, in one of my pupillage chambers, a situation where they had a private agreement with a big London defence firm, where the Crown Court work would go to the more senior people, but they had a secret arrangement with the solicitors, that the solicitors would pocket the legal aid fee, and the pupil would be paid £10 private check.
It was known as home of the £10 brief, those chambers.
Yeah, you raise things, and you know, I've never been someone who's not been able to say something, even if you know it's to your detriment. And I raised it, and obviously it didn't make me very popular. But around that time, and I often tell this story, I was told very bluntly there was this one legendary senior clerk, and he just took me aside. You know, I was labelled a troublemaker because I was kept saying, I'm acutely aware of the briefs I'm not getting that I should be getting. People are asking for me. I know what's going on. And I was told, you know, in very clear terms, it's not us, we're not racist. It's just that certain clients don't appreciate a brown lady, let alone an Asian lady, let alone a Muslim lady representing them. So we can't send you on those briefs. And the story I often give Sonia when I'm lecturing or when I'm training is that court was Snaresbrook. And so I was told, you know, we can't send you to Snaresbrook because the clients won't accept you representing them. And so 16 years later, and so I apologize if people have heard this from me before, but 16 years later, I walked into Snaresbrook as one of its judges. And so it's kind of like, you can't limit me. The only limits I will have are the ones I put on myself. I'm not saying there weren't times I didn't go home in tears, which happened quite regularly. And, you know, some of my white male counterparts were making 30, 40 grand a year. In my first year of practice, after tax, I made £357, which is why I had two jobs. So I worked in the shop at the weekend, and I still worked as a librarian, a job I'd had since I was 14. So I came out of that, and then I went to paper buildings after that. Was when I was 7 years call that a regular brilliant solicitor I used to work for, Maryam Etienne, she called me because she was instructed before he was arrested, and we both started representing Barry George, who was accused of the murder of BBC television presenter Jill Dando. And there was a lot of, you know, at the time, it's still one of the biggest murder cases that's ever been mounted, just in terms of its volume, its publicity, the police effort, the sheer paperwork. But, you know, the first time I turned up at the Old Bailey, it was in Court 1, in front of Mr. Justice Page, they refused to let us in because they didn't believe that we were the actual defence team. And then there was a lot of, you know, oh, you're in Mr. Mansfield's chambers and he's picked you as his junior, to which the answer was, no, I'm in my own chambers, and I've picked Mr. Mansfield to lead me and to represent the case. So I did that, and that was you know, and I ended up doing that for 4 years because we did it from the trial, then his first wrongful conviction, then the Court of Appeals when they originally turned it down, then to the House of Lords as it then was, and then they turned it down, and then to the CCRC, and then eventually Mike and I were potential witnesses, so we bowed out, so he then got given to another team who then took it on. And he was then acquitted. But I remember vividly the phone call that after he was eventually released, even though I hadn't directly been able to represent him for about 2 years, I got a call from Chambers, where I now am, 7BR, to say that he was sitting in the waiting room because he wanted to speak to me. So I was able to speak to him on the phone. So, I mean, that obviously meant a lot. And even now, I mean, it's the 25th anniversary of her death. There's been a Netflix documentary, which I'm not going to lie, we were a little concerned about because we weren't in it. So Michael is there, but the reconstructions were that he was there speaking to people on his own. Yeah.
Michael Mansfield Casey.
Yeah. That he was there on his own, whereas he never had a single meeting with Barry, but I wasn't there. and the lawyer was not there. So it's kind of that kind of spin on it was a little disappointing. So and so I then made a point of, from then, doing what I knew wouldn't be the well-paid work, but it was the work that I was interested in. It was legal aid work, it was publicly funded work, it was crime, it was family predominantly. And then the way it's developed, if we want to move on to that, is that
Yes, sorry to interrupt you, Mariam.
no, do
So,
I talk, so just stop me.
no, it's okay. I've never met a criminal barrister who can't talk. So you have a particular expertise in complex serious sexual abuse cases. At least that's what it says on your website. How did you end up doing those types of cases, and what impact do those types of cases have on you, if any?
No, they do have an impact on you. I suppose traditionally women get moved towards family, care work and family, or in crime into sex work. And I didn't want to be pigeonholed in that, but there is a real skill in doing complex sex work. I even do it now. And it's not just with very young children, but it's with very vulnerable witnesses. And also the law has rapidly changed in terms of how this sort of evidence is now presented. And so we have things like pre-recorded cross-examination, we have pre-recorded evidence, and we have limits on cross-examination. And there's often much more law in sex cases than there is in other kinds of work. And I'm also a specialist ticketed sex judge, which I got appointed on a little while after I became a judge. And how did I get into that? I think you just do one sex case, and if you do it, competently, but I think for me, most importantly, with empathy, then you get asked to do another, and you get asked to do another, and you get asked to do another. But for me, violence, including sexual violence against women and girls in particular, but also men, is something that's always been important to me. So over the last 10, 15 years, I've given pro bono training very regularly to the CPS, to lots of police forces, to lots of NGOs and solicitors firms, about their approach, about dealing with unconscious biases that exist in terms of investigation, in terms of defense work. I do the same in relation to honor crimes, particularly for the CPS.
Can you give us, sorry to interrupt, can you give us an example of unconscious bias in relation to sexual abuse cases?
Well, I think it goes to, particularly in the police investigation, notions of how a woman would behave, how a woman should behave, even in this day and time, particularly if they come from a particular community. I mean, one of the things that I particularly spearhead is the training on controlling and coercive behavior. I did a seminar which I set up, and Lady Justice Thirlwall very kindly agreed to chair it year before last, where the heads of respect came. It was very important for me to include domestic violence against men. So Mankind Initiative attended, and Mark Brooks, who I'd written an article for. And it's sort of taboo subjects and stereotypes and unconscious bias about how things are reported, how they shouldn't be reported, delay in reporting, reaction, all the things that have led to what is now, as you will know, the standard, what's called myths and assumption direction, which every judge should now give in a rape case. And I've said before, and I've said this in a lot of legal lectures I give, I think it should be given in every case, not just sex case, to deal with, to say to a jury, there is no particular type of offender, there is no particular type of victim, but also the notion that, well, we're not going to prosecute this because they're not going to be believed. And so, and that's sort of the test. And a lot of things I often get asked to do, both within the CPS and externally, when people come to me on direct access, is, would you please help us with our victims' right of review, because the Crown Prosecution Service have declined to prosecute this, but we understand that there's a victim's right of review. And I think that also feeds into serious domestic violence and controlling and coercive behavior, the notion that if somebody comes from a particular culture, then it's not that they're being controlled, it's just part of the culture. It's just, they won't have financial independence, they won't have this. which sometimes is right and sometimes is not. And it's just to be the person in the room having those conversations to say, well, no, let's actually explore this more, let's investigate this more. So to your question, that's sort of how I got involved in it. And and at the moment, the focus of it that I'm doing mostly at the moment is I've been asked to do a number of high profile cases, and in particular serving police officers who are charged with rape and sexual offences. So I prosecuted last year the Detective Sergeant Knight, who was charged with the Brighton rape and sexual assault case. I've got another one coming up in a few weeks. I'm prosecuting the young lad from Britain's Got Talent, who's now grown up. One of the things that I have made a point of doing is being a woman of colour, doing things that you don't expect a woman of colour to do. I lead murder prosecutions, and I'm the first Muslim woman to have ever led a murder prosecution at the Old Bailey. I'm a specialist counter-terrorism prosecutor, and I'm the only Muslim woman who does that. So it's because I had a much more diverse experience deliberately that I then applied to be a Crown Court recorder, a part-time Crown Court judge. And it took me a while to work it out, because one of the things you have to consider in any aspect of your practice, as you know, is that if you have a family, you have to work out when you physically are able to have that family. And so I have a 17-year-old and I have a 13-year-old, and I was on maternity leave with her when I applied to become a judge. And so I was part of the old way of doing it. So now there's multiple choice questions, and it's a bit more, I'm not saying it's not still utterly rigorous, but it's a bit more refined. I had to do the take my baby in my arms, give it to my husband in the car park, because she was still breastfeeding, and go into a hotel and take a 3-hour exam, which I hadn't done since my A-levels. And only if I passed the 3-hour exam, where I had to write judgments, would I then move to the next phase, which is then to actually go to the Ministry of Justice to then do a series of very intensive role plays with real judges watching me, and then the interview. So I was, and also because I was a brand new mum, I made it harder for myself, I suppose, because I said, look, I'm only able to sit in London and the Southeast. And whereas they were offering judicial positions if you were appointed all over. And so I was told they only had a handful in London and the Southeast. And I said, look, I don't want to mislead you. If I move to appointment, I can only do that. And they then appointed me, and they said, no, that was fine, because they are moving towards understanding that. And they do want more women, and they do want younger women, and they do want younger men who will obviously have children of school age. My experience has been, I think, mostly positive, but I think it's because I am fairly no nonsense, and so courteous, respectful, everyone has a say. But ultimately, when you're a judge, you're in charge. And if you are not wanting to have that responsibility, then don't apply to become a judge, because you're ultimately there, you're there to make decisions. And I am even now frequently the only person of colour in a judicial dining room. That's getting much, much better. It's sort of, I do the certain level of work, and I do have places. I sit mostly throughout London. I mostly sit at places like Southwark, Snaresbrook, inner London. I did a fair bit of sitting at Chelmsford, Blackfriars before it was closed. And those are, it's really important to me, because those are flagship courts. So I'm very proud that I sit as a judge in what is seen as flagship courts. It's a completely different skill set, because you have to be utterly aware of everything that's going on. You have to be able to give rulings, you have to be able to deal with the jury, you have to be able to deal with defendants, and ultimately you are prosecution and defense, because you have to make sure the prosecution is fairly presented, you have to make sure the defense is fairly presented, you have to make sure that those who are in the public gallery are respected and are respectful. you have to interact with, you know, your court staff, your administration, your judicial colleagues. So you learn a lot, but it is a completely different skill set. I'm not going to say it's not terrifying, but then it's terrifying when you first become a barrister. But it is something that I'm very keen to encourage more and more members of the community, particularly from underrepresented parts of the community, to come into, because I think there is such a large cohort within the criminal justice system that's from the Black and Asian community, that when they go to courts, you know, it's getting much, much better, but when they go to courts, it used to be that there wouldn't be a single person of color they could see who wasn't either the security or the ushers or the clerks.
Yeah.
Now, the ushers and the clerks are, you know, there is so much more representation amongst them, and that's amazing. And also in the custody cohort, but we still need to work on the judges. I mean, one of the examples I give is we have very few Black male judges, and particularly in the Crown Court. You know, we have some brilliant Black male judges, but, you know, there are not enough. And that's something that the judiciary knows. I speak to the judiciary about it, they're consciously aware of it. But that's where, again, unconscious bias comes in, because when the people who make those decisions, they're really working hard on changing it, but it comes from a starting point of them themselves not being as diverse as one would have immediately hoped, because that's traditionally who it's been. I mean, you know, it's taken us 775 years to get our first woman Lady Chief Justice. And there was even a discussion as to whether she should be the Lady Chief Justice or the Lord Chief Justice. So, so for me, I sit as much as I can, because I think that's an important part of my job. I enjoy sitting, but I also do it because I want to be an important part of representation in that aspect of the criminal justice system. And there's many more coming through, and there will be many more coming after me. I'm just one small little piece of it.
Mariam, you've been sitting as a judge, part-time, a recorder, since 2012. You've seen lots of advocates in your courtrooms. You've seen lots of different styles. In your view, what makes a really good advocate?
I think there's a number of things, Sonia. One is that you need to be really prepared, and you do have to work hard, and you need to have mastered your brief. So you need to know the underlying material, the evidence. But two, I think particularly more in the way in which advocacy is now developing and being judged, know who you're talking to, and be very focused in relation to what it is you're trying to do. So the way you speak to a judge on legal submissions is very different to how you would approach questioning a witness, and also how you would approach speaking to a jury. I think have authenticity. Don't in any way think you have to be anything other than yourself, because we are getting to be a much broader church, but we're not all there. But also understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. One of the things that we've seen recently that's developed in the last few years is that there is a real now move to be much stricter with how advocacy is done. And in particular, I mean, I give the training on advocacy to a number of groups, organizations, and part of the profession. And one of the things that we have specific training on is vulnerable witnesses and defendants, which has to be done in a much different way. It's much more controlled. It's now judicially controlled, because they actually look at your questions. And it's, you know, we have things like the Advocates Gateway and toolkits, and it's about what sort of language are you employing, because we now have intermediaries, both for defendants and for witnesses. You know, how is the best way to communicate yourself to them? I think also to have empathy. It is an adversarial process, so there will be part of that, but there's ways of being adversarial. There's different styles. So I think it's that. I think so. That's what I would say in terms of advocacy, and just, you know, ultimately what it is you're trying to say, who is your audience, and what is it you're trying to achieve.
And what advice would you give to anyone who wants to pursue a career at the criminal bar, bearing in mind all of the challenges that the criminal bar faces?
I think the first thing is that you must really want to do it. I don't think anybody becomes a barrister, and particularly a criminal barrister, under any illusions that they're going to make lots of money, because the criminal bar has been hit very much in the reduction of fees. You know, they went on strike quite recently in relation to that. Criminal work is, you know, it's publicly funded work, so by its nature, and I mean the same applies to various elements of family law work. It cannot be well funded in the same way as commercial work is. Also, I think have an idea of what you want to do, but embrace all parts of criminal law to begin with, so you don't limit yourself, because financial crime is very different to sexual offences, it's very different to homicide, it's very different to terrorism and public order. So focus later, I think, and just simple things, you know, go and sit in a Crown Court, watch cases, watch advocacy, try to make connections. It's much easier now than it was when I started. There are many organizations you can join. There are mentoring networks. I wrote about this in the Law Society Gazette about 12 years ago, mentoring networks to try and support you, to try and get you to meet people who are in the profession. Do things like mini pupilages, you know, go and ask to be at a chambers, and ask if you can follow barristers around, but equally do it with solicitors' firms, because when I started, it was a very stark choice. If you were a talker, you became a barrister. If you were a writer or a reader, you became a solicitor. Now there are much more advocacy forums, and solicitors, you know, if they're higher court advocates, they do effectively what barristers do now. But it is a different skill set in terms of meeting somebody off the street, building a case, and then getting within the sort of the court process and the court forum and the advocacy. So I think do all of those things, but ultimately you are going to be tired, you're going to have to work hard, you're not going to be rich, but if you really want to do it, don't be deterred. Just carry on, hold your head up high, and, you know, reach out and do it, because ultimately the profession is better by how much more richer and diverse it is. And where you come from, it doesn't matter where you start, it's where you're going.
I want to thank you, Mariam, for dropping those pearls of wisdom. You are a huge inspiration. I want you to just keep doing what you're doing, keep inspiring, and I know that my audience will enjoy everything that you said in this interview. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sonia, for providing this forum and this channel, for speaking to people like me and allowing us to share our stories. It's really important, so thank you.